Hi everyone, we have moved on to Chapter 10, the last chapter in this section. So we're going to talk about decision making by individuals and groups, and it should be interesting. This is another chapter where there are a lot of other concepts, both ones that we've talked about already and ones that we will talk about in the future will come into play. Okay, so essentially there's two types of decisions. There's program decisions and non-program decisions. Program decisions are things that you do on a routine basis for which you have a set or established policy. So how you go about, hiring new people, how you go about maybe deassessing some property, whatever it may be. And then non-program decisions are things that come up out of the blue that you might not expect. That are for due to changes in the business environment, new products, new procedures, a new product that you might have in your business, that kind of thing, a new branch or something. Okay. All right, decision-making process is pretty straightforward. Recognize the problem and the need for the decision, identify the objective of the decision, gather and evaluate data and diagnose it, and then list and evaluate alternatives. So let's just take, for example, something that some of you are facing right now, that you're graduating. Say you're graduating in June, and you realize the problem is that once June's over, you're not sure what you're going to do. That's the problem. What's going to happen? So the objective of the decision is to do something worthwhile with your life that will make you happy, and there are, a variety of different ways you can go about that. You can go back to school, you can apply for schools, you can apply for jobs, you can maybe stay at ECC and get a degree in, something else. In addition to business, maybe you want to study technologies or something. Anyway, so then you go through and you list and evaluate all the alternatives. Okay, after that, then you select the best course of action. You implement the decision, you gather feedback, see how it goes, and then you follow up and check on it. So that's really like very basic decision-making process. It's can be more complicated, it can be less complicated, depends upon the situation. Okay, so let's talk about how people actually make decisions. And the first model that we're talking about is rationality. So it's this idea that people make decisions based on a completely emotion-free, with all sorts of time, and looking at being able to understand what's going to happen. What are the consequences of each decision, that kind of thing. So it's rational in terms of rational. So having all the information, making it without bias, without judgment, without emotion. Understanding the consequences of each decision, that kind of thing. That's rationality. So how plausible does that sound to you? Not sure. But we do have, because those things are impossible, really, we have a thing called bounded rationality. And it basically says that there are limits as to how rational a decision maker can actually be. We're human. We all make decisions every day. There are lots of things that play into making those decisions. So the idea is that because we have our own preferences, because we have our own physical limitations, because there are other maybe pressures that are coming down on us, that a lot of times people make decisions based very quickly based on a rule of thumb or heuristics. So if knowing that rule of thumb may be something to the effect of you always buy in bulk because bulk is more reasonable. But, maybe with a little bit of delving into it, you might realize that it's not as reasonable because maybe when you buy in bulk, you have to take up too much space on your shelves or something like that. Okay, so bounded rationality, it also assumes there is this satisficing, that people come up with a decision that's just good enough. That satisficing is very bad. You don't necessarily pursue things any further. You don't ask questions. You don't push it at all. And again, this whole idea that you make shortcuts. Okay. So, that's a double slide. I apologize. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so let's talk about another type of decision-making model, the Z model. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about with earlier in the semester with the Myers-Briggs, the second and Myers-Briggs measures 4 things. These are the measurement number 2 and measurement number 3. So basically, how you take an information, is it through your senses, or is it like with a sort of more of a gut feeling, with the intuition, and then how do you make decisions through thinking or feeling? So anyway, the idea of this is that the Z model is that you look at all of these, that you look both at you look at things in terms of the senses, the 5 senses that you're looking at. You also look at things in terms of what's going on, what's the context of it, what are some other issues that might play into it. You might do some brainstorming. Anyway, and you make decisions using both sides of your brain, if you will. That's the idea of the Z model. Okay, so escalation of commitment. I just found that. I don't know. I think it was on Facebook. I took a picture of it, but it kind of makes the point. Don't cling to a mistake just because you spent a lot of time making it. See, another way to look at the escalation of commitment. But escalation of commitment, the textbook definition, is tendency to continue to support a failing course of action. So let's say that you really think that you should locate your new business in XYZ town, and you've spent time, you've talked to architects, you've got plans drawn up, and then as time goes on, maybe about a year or so into it, and then you realize maybe it's not such a good idea because that highway that you thought was going to be going through the town isn't going through the town anymore, and there's some political unrest in the area. So escalation of commitment is hanging on to that and still doing that, even though it's probably a really bad idea and not necessarily a good business decision. But because of some other issues, you don't want to let go. So people like inconsistency, they don't want change. They tend to be overly optimistic about what's going to happen. They feel that they can control the situation. And then sunk cost. Sunk cost is this idea that you've already put so much into it, you're never going to get it back, that you don't want to lose that money. So probably one of the biggest issues with that, we'll talk about how to deal with it. Probably one of the biggest issues with escalation of commitment being a problem is essentially the frail human ego. So what you want to do is make sure that not necessarily one person you want to make sure that there's more than one person responsible for the decision. And then that way, when they decide it's everyone's decision to get into it, and then when they decide to get out of it, it's everybody's decision to get out of it. So also you want to provide people with some sort of graceful exit that they may have, so they can get out of it without much personal or professional embarrassment. Anyway, escalation of commitment can be really bad. Excuse me. And because it just leads you down, sometimes the best thing to know how to do is when to say when. Okay, so let's talk about moving on from that. Individual influences on decision making. One is cognitive style. We talked about that. Again, that's also a Myers-Briggs concept. How you process information, how you take in information, how you make decisions. And then risk aversion is also another very important part of decision making. Some people are more comfortable with risk than others. You can say that, if you're talking about buying stock, who might buy a stock that's, a new business, so that's not necessarily very proven yet. Or, do you want to buy a stock, but what they refer to as blue chip stocks, that's, definitely going to be a definite positive return. So how much risk you are willing to assume will influence, of course, the kind of decisions you make. Okay, intuition and creativity are also individual influences on decision making. Intuition is really important. It's usually comes more with experience, with learned patterns of behavior. If you see something that you recognize, I've seen that before, you recognize it. It's basically involves some sort of learned pattern of information. And then creativity, this idea of being able to come up with novel and useful ideas. Not necessarily everyone is creative. everybody is creative. People have different levels of being in touch with their creativity. So creativity, trying to find a solution that's going to help everyone, or thinking about things from a different perspective that might give just a different outcome. Okay, so influences on creativity, again, your thought process, then also what your personality is like. And then for an organization to be creative, there's this idea we talk a lot about in business these days called nimbleness. How nimble is the business? How easy is it for them to turn around and change? How flexible is the structure? Do they have many people involved in the decision making, or is it just one person making all the decision? So it's also important that there's a match between the organizational, the individual and the organizational influences both. They both, if you have to creative organizations need to have creative people, and creative people need to work in organizations that encourage creativity. So if you're not going to be supported, if you're going to come up with a lot of creative ideas, but the organization itself, is not necessarily very open to creativity, then that's going to be a problem. Okay, let's move on to group decision making. So there's this whole idea of synergy. The idea of synergy is that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. So that it's people being together, and when the process that occurs when people are together, that they come up with bounce off each other and have ideas that they might not have had if they had just been sitting solitarily. So the other thing too, so there's so it's with synergy, positive force that occurs in groups when group members stimulate new solutions to problems through the process of mutual influence and encouragement within the group. Okay, so also there's this idea of social decision schemes, and those are sort of these simple rules that people come up with. So there's a couple of them that we talk about. The majority wins rule, essentially that this group supports whatever position is taken by the majority of people. Truth wins rule says that the correct decision will emerge as an increasing number of members realize its appropriateness. So that everyone will have this moment of enlightenment, so to speak. 2/3 majority rule means that the decision favored by 2/3 or more of the members is supported. So straight math. And then first shift rule is this idea that members support the decision represented by the first shift in opinion shown by a member. So if there's people are all walking down one course, and then all of a sudden they change their mind, that first shift, we're not talking first shift in terms of first shift, second shift, third shift in the workplace. We're talking first shift in thinking. So these are just essentially they say that 80% of the time that these rules work in groups. Who knows? It's another theory that is worth discussing. Okay. All right. So group decision making, of course, there's advantages and disadvantages. Because there's more knowledge, because there's more people on it. And hopefully we've got these cross-functional work teams and decision making teams. People who have a variety of different perspectives. The idea that it's more accepted by the people in the organization because there are people have a ability to voice their opinion and that kind of thing, and that they said that they have a commit that they were able, since they're able to voice their opinion, they have buy-in in it. And also that people have a greater understanding of why the decision was made because they were part of the decision process. So they understand it better. And then also when they go and they talk to other employees who maybe they don't understand the decision, at least they can explain why they did it the way it did. So those are some advantages, that this idea of multiple viewpoints, buy-in, better understanding, that kind of thing. Okay, disadvantages is sometimes there's pressure to conform, particularly when you have maybe people from different stratas and the levels of responsibility in the organization. Sometimes there can be one person or one clique of people can dominate the whole conversation. And also it can be very time consuming, which could drive some people bananas because it just takes too darn long. All right, limits of grouping, group decision making. Groupthink, so bad. We talked about this also when we were talking about work teams and work groups, this idea that people lose their individuality, and they do not, and they also lose the moral compass. How did that happen? Whoops. That there's pressure within the group, and they just do things without questioning it. They lost, as we talked about earlier in the previous chapter, they lose their individuality, so they maybe lose their ability to rationalize things in certain ways. Groupthink is very, very bad. Okay, there's also the tendency for group discussion to produce shifts towards more extreme attitudes. So that there's this idea that we talked about one dominant in the previous slide. We talked about the negative part of it as one dominant personality or a group of people, that you can polarize the group, and it can be, that can be detrimental as well. Okay, preventing groupthink. First of all, before I go any further, I just want to encourage you to really look at and read, and I think it's also worth sometimes doing some extra research about it. In the book, they talk about the Space Shuttle Challenger that went down in 1986, and quite a few astronauts were killed, and it was a terrible, terrible tragedy. And in many ways, that's cited, that's sort of a classic example of groupthink, that there were people just stopped rationalizing. They knew it was going to blow. They knew it. The scientists knew it and told them that it was going to happen because the temperature wasn't right to keep those O-rings safe. So if you have a chance, actually, I shouldn't say that. When you're finished, as soon as you're finished listening to this, be sure to go to your book and read about the Challenger, because it's, as I said, a classic example of groupthink. So how do you prevent groupthink? It has people to really have think of things as critically as possible. I mean, evaluating things, not critical like negative, but critical in terms of analysis, asking questions. Don't have the leader state their opinion, because then people sometimes feel obliged to follow that. Maybe create a bunch of different groups to work simultaneously so that they can they keep each other honest, so to speak. Always have a devil's advocate. That's someone who's the challenger. Remember, we talked about the challenger, not the Challenger spacecraft, but every group. We talked about different roles that people participate in, and we talked about teams and groups. And someone plays devil's advocate or is the challenger. Evaluate the competition, because it's important to understand what you're up against. And then finally, after you get a consensus, maybe rethink the whole thing. Okay, there's a couple different ways that you can handle group decisions. One are self-managed teams. We talked about that in the previous chapter. Dialectical Inquiry is this idea that there's a debate between two different people on the same topic. Nominal group technique is this idea that everybody writes down what their ideas are, and they do it silently and without any authorship, no one authorship, and then they're gone through one by one. No criticism. It's similar to brainstorming. There's no criticism allowed when they go through, when they discuss each one. There's also quality circles and quality teams. The idea about those is not too dissimilar to self-managed teams. The small group of people that work voluntarily on company time, usually about an hour a week, to address work-related problems, quality control, cost reduction, production planning, that kind of thing, even product design. And then quality teams are teams that are part of the organization structure, and they're empowered to act on the decisions regarding product and service quality. So quality circles and quality teams are very important. And the level of activity they have might change. And then devil's advocacy, of course, is this idea that, coming up with, someone always playing the other role, like coming up with the other idea. Okay, so the other thing we need to think about is culture and decision making. Remember, we talked about Hofstede in chapter 2, that styles of decision making vary by culture. So, for instance, individualistic versus social versus collectivist cultures, or high power distance and low power distance are going to impact who's involved in the decision making. Long-term orientation, short-term orientation, all those things from Hofstede are going to impact decision making. So you want to think about that. And then finally, so important in decision making is the idea of ethics. And there are all sorts of different ethics tests. Some are stricter than others, but sort of a basic one. Is it legal? Does it violate a law? Does it violate a company policy? Is it fair for everyone? And does it promote some sort of win-win relationship? So is it legal? Is it balanced? And then how will it make me feel about myself, or how will it perhaps make other people feel about me when you're making a decision? So would you want your parent or guardian or someone, or your children, someone who you really respect and whose opinion means so much to you, would you want them to know that you made that decision? So these are all things that people think about. Okay, so that's it with Chapter 10 in Decision Making, and the end of this section. And then we'll be back after the next test to talk about Chapter 11, which is Power and Political Behavior. Okay, thanks, guys.